For 10 years, my son-in-law beat me and stole everything I had built. One morning, when I could no longer bear it, I pretended to fall down the stairs and passed out. Terrified, he rushed me to the emergency room to cover up his crime, but when the doctor walked in, his face went pale as a corpse. He must have realized he had just walked into the trap I had been carefully preparing for months. Hello everyone, thank you for being here. Before I reveal what happened when that doctor walked in, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. Important note, this is a fictional narrative designed for storytelling and reflection, though the underlying message holds genuine value. Let's begin. The world slows down when glass shatters on marble. 1,000 shards of orange-tinted crystal scattering like a warning I was too slow to heed. I stood by the kitchen window of the sprawling Stafford estate, the early morning light of Lake Oswego reflecting off the surfaces of a home that felt increasingly like a mausoleum. My name is Wayne Faulkner, a 68-year-old retired bridge inspector with a slight tremor in my right hand and eyes that have seen decades of structural decay. That tremor, a rhythmic betrayal born of Parkinson's, was the culprit today. I watched paralyzed as the pulp-heavy liquid seeped into the tan suede of Sherman Stafford's Italian loafers. Sherman, 44. A maritime law partner with a sharp jawline and expensive loafers that usually clicked ominously on the marble floor, looked down at his feet. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the sound of the glass. It was the hand, Sherman, I said, my voice thin and rasping. I couldn't help it. He didn't erupt immediately. Instead, he stared me down with a cold, calculated malice that chilled me more than the autumn air outside. He took a slow step forward, and with the deliberate precision of a man who enjoyed the weight of his own power, he ground a jagged shard of glass into the floor with his heel, crushing it into white powder while maintaining unblinking eye contact. Those shoes cost more than your monthly medication, you old wreck. He hissed, his heavy breathing filling the space between us with the metallic smell of orange juice and floor cleaner. Before I could offer another apology, the air was whipped out of my lungs. Sherman snapped his hand, flying out to shove my shoulder with a force that sent me reeling. I stumbled back, my hip catching the sharp edge of the granite kitchen island with a sickening thud before I slid helplessly to the floor. The cold, unyielding texture of the kitchen tiles pressed against my bruised cheek as I gasped for air. I'm done cleaning up after a dying man, he roared, towering over me like a predator. He swung a foot, his expensive shoe connecting with my ribs in a dull, heavy strike. Crack. Not the glass this time. My rib. The pain was a white-hot flash that blinded me for a second, leaving me curled in a pathetic ball on the floor. Please stop, I wheezed, my fingers scratching uselessly at the grout. Sherman, please. He didn't stop. He vented his frustration with a series of curses, each word punctuated by the rasp of his breath and the looming threat of another blow. That was when I heard the clicking of heels. Jacqueline Stafford, 40. A senior marketing director who hid her anxiety behind layers of designer makeup and a constant forced smile entered the kitchen. She stopped at the edge of the marble, her hand gripping a porcelain coffee mug. Jacqueline, I managed to croak, reaching a trembling, bleeding hand toward my daughter. Help me. She looked at the spilled juice, then at Sherman's reddened face, and finally at me. For a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of the little girl I used to carry on my shoulders. But then her eyes went flat. How many times had I carried her on these same shoulders when she was 6? The weight of a daughter's silence is much heavier. Sherman, honey, she said softly, her voice devoid of any warmth for the man on the floor. Let's just go to the living room. You shouldn't let yourself get this worked up before work. She stepped toward him, but as she did something that broke what was left of my heart. She didn't kneel. She didn't check my pulse. She reached down and delicately kicked a large piece of glass away from Sherman's path, clearing a safe walkway for him, while completely ignoring my mangled hand. I watched the hem of her designer skirt disappear around the corner, leaving me alone on the cold marble with a man who no longer looked human. The tap water ran with a clinical hiss, drowning out the sound of my ragged breathing, as Sherman's heavy footsteps finally faded down the hall. I lay there for a moment, the cold marble kitchen floor pressing against my skin like a slab in a morgue. The stinging heat in my side where his boot landed felt like a brand, a visceral reminder of my sudden obsolescence in this house. With a groan that tasted of iron and bile, I reached out with my left hand, the steady one, and gripped the edge of the kitchen island. I hauled myself up my ribcage, screaming with every inch of progress, until I was slumped against the granite. The muffled sound of Sherman's SUV engine starting in the driveway vibrated through the floor, a low growl of departure that should have brought relief, but only left a hollow vacuum. Jacqueline reappeared moments later. She didn't come to help me stand. She didn't offer a hand or an apology. Instead, she carried a roll of paper towels and a bottle of lemon-scented floor cleaner. Her face a mask of practiced indifference. She knelt where I had fallen and began wiping away the spilled juice, her perfectly manicured hands trembling slightly as she folded the paper towel. "Jacqueline, look at me." I wheezed, my voice sounding like gravel under a wheel. "He kicked me. I didn't fall because of the tremors. He pushed me." She didn't look up. The smell of the lemon cleaner filled the air, sharp and artificial, trying to mask the iron scent of blood from where my hand had caught a stray shard. "You know how he gets when things aren't in order, Dad," she said, her voice flat. "You shouldn't have been so clumsy. It's hard enough for us to keep this house running without having to worry about these accidents." I felt a surge of cold fury. It wasn't just fear I saw in the set of her shoulders. It was a choice. "I was the one who suggested Sherman take full control of your schedule," she added finally, looking at me with eyes that were as polished and hard as the marble. "To prevent this, to keep you safe from yourself." She was a bridge I had built with my own sweat and blood, but as I looked at her now, I saw the structural rot I'd ignored for years. I followed her into the living room, my gait lopsided, my breath coming in short, painful hitches. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer echoed in the silence, counting down the seconds of a life I no longer recognized. "Jacqueline," I said, leaning against the doorframe for support. "I am still your father. He assaulted me in your kitchen." She pivoted her silk blouse, catching the morning light. "Maybe your medication is off again?" she suggested, her tone patronizing, the ultimate gaslight. "You're getting confused, and it's making Sherman stressed. We have a reputation in this town, Dad. We can't have people thinking you're losing your mind because you can't handle your own body. Have you ever seen a person you love turn into a stranger while they're standing right in front of you? I saw it then. I saw the senior marketing director calculating the cost of my dignity against the value of her social standing. Is this house worth your soul, Jackie? I asked, the words feeling heavy and bitter in my mouth. She checked her $15,000 gold watch and sighed, a sound of pure inconvenience. I'm late for the office. Just stay in your room and rest, okay? Don't make a scene when he gets back tonight. He's working on a big merger. She grabbed her leather briefcase, her movements fluid and devoid of the hesitation that usually comes with guilt. Oh, and Dad, I've already signed the preliminary health assessment papers Sherman drafted. We need a professional baseline for your mental decline before things get worse. She walked away without looking back, but it wasn't the click of her heels that haunted me. It was the realization that in this house I wasn't the father anymore. I was the inventory. Shadows are the only things that don't flinch in this house. They stretch across my bedroom floor, indifferent to the way I have to crawl onto the mattress to save my dignity. The darkness of the bedroom felt like a sanctuary after the bright, cruel light of the kitchen, but it was a cold comfort. Every muscle in my side throbbed where Sherman's boot had made contact, a deep, rhythmic ache that mirrored the mechanical clicking of the HVAC system overhead. I lay back against the pillows, staring at the silver-cold moonlight cutting across the bedsheets, and reached for the silver-framed photograph on my nightstand. Sarah Faulkner, the ghost of a woman whose warmth once filled the cold marble of this estate, lived on only in that picture, and the echo of a promise she shouldn't have made. I traced the glass over her smile, my thumb trembling against her cheek. "I'm sorry, Sarah," I whispered into the hollow silence. I couldn't keep the bridge standing. The family structure I had spent 40 years building hadn't just cracked. It had suffered a total collapse. Jacqueline wasn't the girl we raised anymore. She was a stranger wearing my daughter's face, a marketing director who saw her father as a depreciating asset. I closed my eyes and let the memory take me back 3 years to that sterile hospice room where the air smelled of bleach and fading life. Sarah had taken my hand back when the tremors were just a whisper, a secret we only shared with each other. "Promise me you'll let her help you, Wayne." She had urged, her eyes bright with a desperate kind of hope. "She has your heart." I had squeezed her hand and lied. "I promise, Sarah. I'll be safe with her," Sarah lied. Or maybe she was just the only one who still believed in fairy tales. In the darkness of the present, I remembered a detail that had seemed insignificant then. Sarah had tried to write me a letter in those final days, her hand shaking worse than mine does now. She had mentioned private doubts about Sherman, a rot she sensed beneath his maritime law prestige. But Jacqueline had intercepted it. I remembered her tucking a cream-colored envelope into her purse, telling me it was just a list of medical instructions. She had kept me in the dark about the true depth of the rot until the structural failure was unavoidable. My Parkinson's is a slow earthquake, but Sherman Stafford is the wrecking ball. I pulled a drawer open, the faint smell of Sarah's lavender perfume still lingering in the wood, and reached for my water glass. My throat felt dry and papery, a desert of thirst that made it hard to swallow. As I fumbled for my medication bottle in the dark silhouette of the furniture, I realized something that turned my blood to ice. The plastic clicked against my fingernails, feeling suspiciously light. I tilted it toward the moonlight. Empty. It should have lasted another 2 weeks. Sherman wasn't just waiting for me to be clumsy. He was withholding the very chemistry that kept me functional. He was engineering my decline, ensuring I stayed physically weak and mentally clouded, so his health assessment papers would look like a prophecy instead of a hit job. I sat up, the pain in my ribs sharp and demanding, but my mind suddenly grew steady. I spent my life inspecting the world for failures, looking for the rust that doesn't sleep, and the stress fractures that hide in the dark. If the bridge is going down, I'm choosing where it lands. I looked at my hand, watching it shake against the darkness, but the fear was gone. It was replaced by a familiar, cold, mental state structural analysis. If the supports are compromised beyond repair, you don't keep patching the cracks. You identify the rot, and you remove it. I closed my eyes, but I didn't pray. I started calculating the load-bearing capacity of the lies holding this house together, and for the first time since the glass shattered, I felt the tremor stop. A rhythmic scratch, scratch, scratch at my door, 3 times low and urgent, was the only signal that the coast was clear of the vipers. The morning light brought no warmth, only the realization that I was a prisoner in a suit of my own skin. I remained motionless on the bed, my ribs protesting with every shallow breath, until the door creaked open. Lorraine, 52, a woman with tired eyes and hands that smelled of antiseptic and courage, had been my caregiver for 6 months, and it turned out my only ally. She didn't turn on the overhead light, preferring the dim safety of the drawn curtains. She moved toward me with a basin of warm water and a fresh towel, but her eyes weren't on the medical supplies. They were on the dark, mottled bruises blossoming across my chest. "He did a number on your ribs, Wayne," she whispered, her voice tight with a simmering fury. This isn't just clumsiness anymore. I tried to sit up, a sharp hiss of pain escaping my teeth. "I'm an old bridge, Lorraine. I can take a bit of wind." But we both knew the structural damage was deeper than bone. She leaned in closer, her movements practiced and clinical to any hidden cameras that might be watching. But her words were a jagged blade of reality. "Sherman isn't just waiting for you to get worse," she said, her breath smelling of peppermint. "He's actively bribing a doctor to sign an involuntary commitment order by the end of the week. He wants the paperwork finished before you can cause any more trouble at the firm." The Heights. Sounds like a luxury hotel. It's actually a tomb with better plumbing. I felt a cold sweat break across my neck. I'd heard Sherman mention the place before, usually in the context of dumping problematic clients. "They're moving the paperwork fast." Lorraine continued, her hands trembling slightly as she dipped a cloth into the water. "Sherman mentioned accelerated cognitive decline to the board yesterday. They want me in a cage where I can't testify about the accounts." I looked at the distant, muffled sound of a vacuum cleaner elsewhere in the mansion, a domestic noise masking a legal kidnapping. The walls of the Stafford estate seemed to shrink around me. Lorraine adjusted my pillows, her body shielding me from the view of the doorway. "Hide this," she murmured, pressing something small, hard, and wrapped in plastic into my palm. My fingers closed around the crinkle of the wrapping. It was a small, cheap flip phone and a charger. "Don't use the house Wi-Fi. Only call when you're alone." I felt the weight of the plastic. It's the first weapon I've held in years. The flip phone felt like a live grenade in my palm, dangerous, heavy, and my only chance to blow a hole in their perfect world. "Why are you doing this, Lorraine?" I asked, my voice barely a thread. "You'll lose everything if they find out." She paused, her eyes darkening with a memory I hadn't seen before. "My own brother was processed by one of Sherman's facilities," she admitted, her voice dropping to a gravelly tone. "They called it care. I called it a slow death. This isn't just about you, Wayne. It's about a personal debt I owe to the Stafford empire." She pulled a fresh, rough-textured towel over my hand to hide the device. I felt a spark of tactical readiness ignite in my chest, a fire I thought Sherman had kicked out of me. I began to slide the phone toward the edge of the mattress, planning to tuck it deep within the stuffing. I had to be an inspector again, finding the one point of failure in their plan. As Lorraine stood to leave, gathering her basin and the soiled linens, the door handle turned with a sudden, sharp click. Sherman was standing there, his silhouette blocking the morning light from the hallway, his eyes scanning the room for anything that didn't belong. Adrenaline is a liar. It told my heart to hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird, even as I forced my face to become as expressionless as the stone statues in the foyer. I didn't blink. If I blinked, the bulge of the burner phone tucked deep beneath the rough cotton of the towel would look like a mountain to a predator like Sherman. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette a sharp-edged intrusion against the morning light. The antiseptic smell of his expensive cologne preceded him, a scent that always reminded me of cold steel and hospital corridors. "Is there a problem here, Lorraine?" he asked, his voice dripping with a casual authority that didn't reach his eyes. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Lorraine didn't flinch, though I saw her grip on the basin tighten. She played her part with the weary patience of a woman who had dealt with arrogant men for decades. "Just changing the linens, Mr. Stafford. Your father-in-law had a restless night." Sherman didn't look at her. He looked at me. His gaze drifted to the unmade bed, specifically the spot where my hand rested near the hidden device. I just can't remember where I put my glasses." "Sherman," I said, allowing my voice to crack and my right hand to perform a violent, uncontrolled tremor. "Everything is a bit blurry today." I leaned into the weakness, letting my head tilt slightly, as if I were struggling to keep the world in focus. It was a calculated risk. I realized then that my involuntary shaking actually allowed me to see things Sherman missed. While he was busy cataloging my decay, I was watching the reflection of a hidden camera lens in a polished silver tray on my dresser. A small, dark eye I hadn't noticed until the light hit it just right. Sherman let out a short, dismissive breath, the sound of a man satisfied with his own superiority. "Stay in bed, Wayne. We can't have you wandering around and hurting yourself again." He turned on his heel and left Lorraine following him out after a final silent nod of warning. I waited. I waited until the distant rhythmic ticking of the foyer clock was the only heartbeat left in the house. Once the mid-morning silence settled, I began my scouting mission under the guise of light exercise. I moved through the opulent hallways with the slow, deliberate pace of a man counting his steps. But my mind was mapping every inch. He's turning my home into a fortress, I realized. But a fortress is just a prison with a bigger budget. Family photos had been removed from the mahogany sideboards, replaced by minimalist art that felt as hollow as the people now living here. If a man builds a cage in the middle of a palace, is he the jailer? Or is he just the first person afraid to leave? I noted 3 more pinhole cameras, their angles overlapping to cover every exit except the service corridor. That was my target. I shuffled toward the back of the estate, my heart rate spiking as the carpet gave way to the cold, functional tile of the basement hall. I reached the service door and stopped. It used to be a simple oak panel, but now it was a heavy steel slab equipped with a high-end electronic keypad that glowed with an eerie blue light. This was where Sherman spent his late nights locked away with the secrets of the Stafford Empire. A 6-digit code. The distance between my freedom and my grave. Beep! The sound of the lock was a digital heartbeat. Cold. Artificial. Final. I leaned in my nose, catching the faint humming of the electronics. I examined the keypad, looking for the telltale wear on the buttons. My inspector's eyes didn't fail me. The numbers 05122 and 1 were slightly more polished than the others. May 12th, 2021. The date Sarah died. The sick irony of using the day I lost everything as his password felt like a physical blow to my gut. My fingers hovered over the numbers, trembling with more than just the disease. I heard a floorboard creak directly behind me. The shadow on the wall lengthened a dark shape that didn't belong to me. Terror is a cold sweat that turns my skin into a conductor for every stray vibration in this cavernous house. I held my breath, my trembling fingers frozen inches from the blue-lit keypad, waiting for the heavy hand of Sherman Stafford to clamp down on my shoulder and drag me back into the light. Then a soft, whirring hum filled the corridor. I exhaled a ragged and uneven sound of pure relief as the automated vacuum cleaner bumped harmlessly against the mahogany baseboard and pivoted away into the darkness. Not today. Not like this. The scare crystallized my resolve with the sharpness of a diamond. The basement was a vault, a high-risk gamble for a man whose body broadcasted his presence with every unintended twitch. I needed a different approach, one that utilized the silence of the night rather than the exposure of the day. I retreated to my room, waiting out the endless agonizing afternoon before deciding to strike the office at midnight. The basement is a vault, I told myself as I watched the clock. But the office is a vanity project. I knew Sherman. His arrogance often led to sloppy desk management once the sun went down and the whiskey came out. When the house finally settled into a heavy graveyard, silence, I crept down the hall. The air in Sherman's home office was thick and cloying with the smell of expensive leather and stale cigar smoke. I used a small penlight, the precise click sounding like a gunshot in the absolute stillness of the room. Using a thin piece of metal from my old bridge inspection kit, I bypassed the simple drawer lock on his mahogany desk. I found it almost immediately a folder labeled private in bold black ink. Inside was a legal draft for an emergency conservatorship. I felt a cold, vibrating rage as I scanned the numbers on the page. 180,000. My entire life's work gone in 3 clinical wire transfers. He didn't even wait for me to die before he started carving up the carcass. Do you know what $180,000 looks like to a man who spent 40 years hanging from steel cables in the freezing rain? It looks like every minute of sleep I ever lost. every joint that aches in the cold, and every sacrifice I made for a family that is now robbing me blind, as the blue glow of the computer monitor's standby light pulsed like a dying heart. I turned the page and felt my stomach drop into a bottomless pit. There was a bank statement showing that Jacqueline had been co-signing the withdrawals. She wasn't just a passive bystander. She was an active beneficiary of the theft her elegant signature repeated like a recurring betrayal on every single line. I felt the final chord of familial loyalty snap within me with a sickening pop. Tucked behind the financial records was a glossy brochure for the Heights. It wasn't a clinic. It was a secure asset protection residence. Notes in the margin in Sherman's sharp, aggressive handwriting detailed a plan to sell my childhood home to cover the massive entry fee. I cross-referenced the amount with a separate crumpled letter in the wastebasket. It matched Sherman's recent gambling debts to a maritime syndicate perfectly. They aren't protecting me. They're harvesting me. I whispered, the paper-cut sharpness of the legal documents stinging my thumbs. This isn't a family home. It's a butcher shop. Friday. 2 days left. 2 days to be a father, or 2 days to be a ghost in my own skin. I had to move faster than the rot. As I prepared to slip the files into my robe, my penlight caught a digital recorder on the desk. I pressed play, and Sherman's voice filled the room. "The doctor is ready," the recording rasped. "We move him Friday morning whether he's awake or not." I clutched the files to my chest, the paper sharp against my skin. Then I heard it, the distinct crunch of gravel under tires in the driveway. Sherman was home early. The headlights swept across the office ceiling like the searchlights of a prison camp, pinning me in the dark. The garage door groaned like a dying beast, and I had exactly 40 seconds to become a shadow before Sherman's heavy footfalls hit the hardwood. The headlights swept across the office ceiling like the searchlights of a prison camp. But I was already moving my heart a frantic hammer against the stolen files beneath my shirt. I slipped through the door and ducked into the laundry chute closet in the hallway, the sharp, metallic taste of adrenaline flooding my mouth. Through the slats of the closet door, I watched Sherman enter the foyer, the smell of expensive bourbon on his breath wafting into my cramped sanctuary. Jacqueline was there, her face a mask of exhaustion that cracked the moment he spoke. "It's done, Jackie," he growled, his voice thick with a drunken, aggressive edge. "The facility staff will be here at dawn Friday. No more accidents, no more excuses." I expected her to argue to show some sliver of the daughter I once knew, but instead, she leaned back against the wall. "I'm scared of what he'll do if we don't." "Sherman," she whispered, and for a second, I thought it was empathy. Then she continued, her voice hardening. "Just make sure the paperwork is airtight. I need those debts cleared. I can't have the bank coming for my accounts because of what I owe." She chose the money over my safety, a betrayal that turned my primal fear into a cold, predatory clarity. I waited until their bedroom door clicked shut before I crept back to my own room, my shadow stretching long and thin against the walls, like a ghost in my own home. My life was a suspension bridge with every cable snapping one by one, but even a falling bridge can crush the thing that broke it. Safe inside my room, I locked the door and spread the stolen financial documents across my bed, placing them next to my old bridge maintenance manuals. The cold, clinical glow of the bedside lamp illuminated the blueprint of my life. I began to view the Stafford family not as people I loved, but as a structure with a fatal resonance frequency. In engineering, every material has a limit. If you apply the right amount of stress at the perfect interval, even the strongest steel will shatter. Sherman was the load-bearing lie of this house. To save myself, I didn't need to outrun him. I just needed to remove the pillar. I spent hours calculating the load. I looked through the pre-nuptial files I had grabbed and found a mention of a vintage watch collection Sherman kept in a glass display, a trophy of his vanity. A bridge doesn't fall because it's weak. It falls because it's pushed at the wrong rhythm. Sherman's rhythm was rage and greed. I began mapping the house's acoustics and the security camera blind spots I had identified earlier, planning a psychological demolition that would leave him no room to hide. If the truth can't set you free, can a well-engineered lie do the job instead? I asked myself, the rhythmic scratching of my pencil against a legal pad, the only sound in the room. The yellowed, comforting scent of old engineering blueprints grounded me. I realized that my Parkinson's tremors, usually my greatest shame, followed a specific frequency. If I positioned myself near the smart home's sensitive vibration-based sensors at the right moment, I could trigger a house-wide alarm that would bring the police to our door while Sherman was in the middle of an outburst. I was no longer an inventory item to be moved. I was the inspector finding the fault line. I stared at the blueprint of my own destruction. Realizing the final piece of the trap required me to let Sherman strike me one more time. This time, however, the whole world would be watching. I folded the papers with steady hands, a grim satisfaction settling in my gut. Sherman Stafford thought he was clearing out the trash, but he had no idea I was about to bring the whole house down on his head. The morning of the final 48 hours arrived with a sky the color of galvanized steel. Pain is an old friend, predictable and honest, unlike the daughter who watched me bleed or the son-in-law who thinks he's already inherited my grave. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, the scent of fresh floor wax rising to meet me like a warning. Steady, old man. One last bridge to cross. My right hand was a piston of erratic motion, but my mind was a calm, dark pool. I carefully activated the recording app on the burner phone and tucked it into my breast pocket, the plastic edge pressing against my ribs. With a deliberate, trembling motion, I spilled a few ounces of water from my glass onto the top marble step. It was a small, clumsy error, the kind a senile man makes. Let's see if you can handle the weight, Sherman. I waited, grounding myself in the reality of my physical decay, using it as a cloak for the clarity of my intent. When Sherman emerged from his bedroom, he looked like a man fraying at the edges. His suit was expensive, but his eyes were hollowed out by the pressure of the impending facility logistics. He saw the water, then he saw me. He didn't just want my money. He wanted my disappearance to be a relief. I didn't wait for him to start the lecture. I know about the offshore account, Sherman, I said, my voice dropping the facade of confusion. I know about the gambling debts to the syndicate. I know you're broke and desperate. He froze, his face draining of color before a dark, mottled purple began to climb his neck. His shock was a physical thing, a bridge support buckling under an unforeseen load. Then the murderous rage took over. You're a senile parasite, Wayne, he spat, closing the distance between us until I could smell his stale sweat. You're going to a room with no windows, and you're going today. He didn't know I saw the decorative railing spindle he'd loosened earlier that morning, a crude trap I'd already bypassed by shifting my weight to the left. He lunged for my collar, his hands shaking with the need to silence me. I didn't fight back. Instead, I leaned into his momentum, calculating my center of gravity with the precision of a structural engineer. As he shoved me, I let my feet go. Gravity is the only law Sherman can't bribe. It's the ultimate inspector. The world tilted into a chaotic blur of fractured light from the crystal chandelier overhead. I felt the rhythmic, sickening thud of my body against each marble tier, shoulder, hip, ribs. It was a violent strobe light descent. Help, Sherman, please. I screamed, the sound echoing through the vaulted ceiling. He didn't reach out. He watched with a terrifying, predatory stillness. Stay down, you old bastard, he hissed as I hit the final landing. The sudden ringing silence that followed the final thud was more painful than the impact. I lay there, the taste of blood metallic and hot in my mouth, the world spinning in slow, dizzying circles. Through the haze of real pain, I reached into my pocket. My pre-alerted call to emergency services was already active on the burner phone. With a hidden fluid motion, I smeared a bit of the red ink I'd kept palmed against a sharp edge of the bottom step, ensuring the head wound looked critical to anyone who walked through the door. I forced my eyes to roll back, feigning the onset of a coma. Then I heard the click of heels. I saw Jacqueline standing in the doorway. She didn't scream. She didn't run to me. Her phone was raised, but her thumb wasn't on the emergency dial. She was recording me, her face cold and clinical, capturing evidence of my supposed instability to justify the cage they had built for me. I lay perfectly still, a broken man on a marble floor, waiting for the blue and red lights to transform the house into a crime scene. The world came back in sharp, jagged shards of white light and the copper tang of blood pooling under my tongue. Blue and red lights began to dance against the frosted glass of the front door. Though the sirens were still distant, a haunting melody of accountability that Sherman was determined to outrun. I lay there, the cold, damp feeling of the foyer marble lingering on my skin like a shroud. Sherman's face loomed over mine, twisted with a desperate feral energy. "He's bleeding everywhere, Sherman," Jacqueline cried out, her voice thin and brittle. This wasn't the plan. We can't have him looking like this when the evaluators see him. "Shut up and grab his legs!" Sherman snapped his eyes, darting toward the street. "We're taking him to the heights now. If we wait for a siren to pull into this driveway, we're done." He grabbed me under the arms, his grip bruisingly tight, and began to haul my dead weight across the floor. I let my head loll back, feigning a deeper darkness than I inhabited. I felt the vibration of the marble floor transition into the plush carpet, and then the rougher texture of the garage concrete. Jacqueline stayed behind her shadow, hovering in the doorway of the kitchen. I realized then she wasn't coming. She was already reaching for the cleaning supplies to scrub away the evidence of our confrontation. She was distancing herself, playing the part of the grieving, innocent daughter who was merely upstairs when her tragic, confused father had his final accident. Sherman heaved me into the back seat of his SUV, the nauseating sway of the vehicle making my stomach churn. Have you ever felt the leather of a $100,000 car against a face wet with your own blood? It's the ultimate irony of the Stafford legacy, surrounded by luxury while the soul is being liquidated. Sherman drove like a madman, the aggressive, rhythmic clicking of his turn signal sounding like a countdown. He periodically looked back, his face a mask of sweating arrogance. "You think that little stunt changed anything, old man?" He hissed, his voice trembling with the adrenaline of the theft. "You're going into a box, Wayne, and I'm going to make sure the lid is nailed tight. You're delirious, you're dangerous, and by noon you'll be a ward of the state with no voice left to complain." I didn't answer. I kept my hand tight on the burner phone, still hidden in my pocket, feeling the steady heat of it against my thigh. I focused on my breathing, enduring the sharp stabs of pain in my ribs. Every time the SUV took a corner too fast, the morning sun began to bleed through the tinted windows, a blinding glare that mocked my condition. The facility loomed ahead, like a concrete gargoyle ready to swallow the inconvenient remains of a life well lived. It was a fortress of beige stone and electrified fencing designed to keep the world out and the assets in. The SUV screeched to a halt at the high-security gates. I saw the orderlies waiting, two large, faceless men in clinical white scrubs. Sherman jumped out, his voice high and frantic, as he waved the forged commitment papers. He had a severe fall and a psychotic episode, he told them, his words tripping over each other. "Get him inside before he hurts himself further." As they opened the rear door, I felt the phone in my pocket vibrate once, twice, a signal from Lorraine. My heart found a new gear. "I have the recording, Sherman." I managed to wheeze, forcing my eyes to open and lock onto his. He laughed, a harsh, jagged sound, and reached in to drag me out. The heavy steel doors of the facility hummed open, but the siren behind us was suddenly much louder, a screaming wall of sound that tore through the morning air. Sherman froze, his hand still clamped like a vice on my bruised arm, his gaze fixed on the rearview mirror. I didn't struggle against the orderlies. I simply smiled through the blood because I could see the police cruiser pulling up right behind us. Lorraine didn't just give me a phone, she tracked it. The flashing blue lights reflected in Sherman's eyes, turning his victory into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The ambulance bay didn't smell like victory. It smelled like bleach-old blood and the frantic sweat of a man who realized his golden goose was finally squawking to the feds. I slumped in the seat as Officer Miller, a young patrolman whose crisp uniform belied the look of deep suspicion he kept leveled at Sherman's expensive SUV, approached the driver's side window. Lorraine had been one step ahead of the fall. She had reported a kidnapping in progress using the burner phone's GPS data before my feet even left the top step. Under Miller's watchful eye, Sherman was forced to divert from the private facility to the County General ER officer. He's had a terrible fall. Sherman stammered, his voice climbing an octave. He's not in his right mind. He was playing the worried son-in-law for the audience, but as soon as Miller stepped back to check the plates, Sherman leaned over the center console. "Keep your mouth shut, Wayne." He hissed, his eyes wide, "or the hospital will be the last place you ever see." I didn't blink. I just let my jaw slacken, playing the part of the frail victim, to ensure the law stayed within arm's reach. The SUV came to a jerky halt at the emergency entrance. Orderlies appeared with a gurney, and the transition was a blur of fluorescent lights and the sharp, stinging scent of rubbing alcohol. I felt the cold air hit my skin as they wheeled me through the sliding doors, leaving the morning sun behind. Have you ever noticed how the fluorescent lights in a hospital strip away every lie you've tried to tell yourself? They aren't meant for comfort. They are meant for scrutiny. And for the first time in months, I felt like the light was finally on my side. Sherman tried to push past the intake desk, his face a mask of practiced concern. "I'm his primary guardian. I have the right to be there," he barked. That's when I met Nurse Carol. Nurse Carol, 58, wore sensible shoes and a gaze that could cut through a lawyer's bullshit faster than a scalpel through gauze. She had the hands of a healer and the eyes of a detective. "Sir, stay behind the yellow line," she commanded, her voice a calm but immovable barrier. "I need to assess the patient alone." Sherman bristled, his hand tightening on his briefcase. "I told you I have legal authority." Carol didn't even look up from my chart. "You have the right to wait in the lobby. I have a job to do. Go sit down." Click. The curtain rings sounded like a firing squad or a sanctuary. I couldn't decide yet, but as the heavy fabric swept shut, the silence of the triage room felt like a shield. Carol began the physical exam, her touch clinical and thorough. She hummed low in her throat as she peeled back my blood-soaked shirt. The crinkle of the paper lining the exam table was the only other sound. She didn't just look at the fresh gash on my head. Her eyes traced the older finger-shaped bruises on my forearms and the prominent ribs that spoke of missed meals. She reached for her stethoscope, the cold metal touch on my chest, sending a shiver through me. The rhythmic, high-pitched chirp of distant monitors filled the gaps. "These marks on your wrists, Wayne," she said softly, leaning in until I could see the hardness in her eyes. They didn't come from a staircase. I looked at her, my hand trembling as I reached into my robe pocket. "I have a phone," I whispered, my voice cracked. "Please." "The recording is on it." Carol froze, her eyes scanning my face with a new intensity. "I'm not just a nurse, Wayne," she whispered, her hands already reaching for a forensic kit. "I specialize in geriatric forensic nursing. I'm documenting a crime scene." She leaned in closer, her voice barely clearing the sound of the heart monitor. "I'm calling the social worker, Wayne, but you need to tell me right now. Where is the rest of the evidence?" The waiting room door swung open, and I heard Sherman's voice rising in that practiced, concerned family man pitch that always preceded a disaster. I reached for the burner phone hidden in the secret fold of my gown, but the sound of his booming authority froze my blood. Nurse Carol looked at me, her hand poised to take the evidence, but the momentum shifted as the curtain was ripped aside. Sherman burst into the exam room, his face a mask of frantic worry that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. He didn't come alone. He was already on his cell phone demanding that his own private physician be granted immediate access. I realized with a jolt of terror that Sherman had already called his own bought doctor to the hospital to override any local findings. "He's delusional," Carol Sherman shouted, ignoring the orderly trying to restrain him. "He doesn't know what he's handing you. My father-in-law has advanced dementia. He thinks he's in a spy novel, not an emergency room. I know a threat when I hear one," Sherman Carroll said, stepping between my gurney and my son-in-law. "Step back and let me do my job." The room felt suddenly small, filled with the cloying, expensive scent of Sherman's cologne clashing with the sharp ER antiseptic. The steady cold beep of my heart monitor began to accelerate, a rhythmic snitch, betraying my rising panic. Sherman's voice. It's a sandpaper rasp that usually signals the end of my autonomy. He leaned over me, his shadow swallowing the light. "Wayne, give me whatever you're holding. You're confused. You're hurting yourself." I gripped the rough texture of the paper gown with sweating palms, the phone a heavy weight against my hip. The tension was a physical pressure, a tightening noose until a new presence entered the arena. Dr. Elias Bailey, the head of ER, carried the weary authority of a man who had seen every way a human body could break his eyes, 2 chips of flint behind wire-rimmed glasses. He stepped into the room with a blinding white coat and an icy demeanor that silenced even Sherman. "I am the attending," Bailey said, his voice flat and dangerous. "I'll decide what's delusional here." Sherman shifted his tone instantly, smoothing his tie and adopting a scholarly air. "Doctor, we have the conservatorship papers nearly finalized. He needs an immediate transfer to a private neurological facility, not triage in a public ward. He's been prone to self-harm and fabricated memories." Bailey didn't respond immediately. He took the chart from Carol, his eyes darting between the notes, the bruises on my arms, and the man standing over me. The silence that followed was a bridge with a rusted bolt screaming internally just before the snap. Sherman was pacing like a caged wolf behind the frosted glass partition, his confidence starting to fray under the doctor's wordless scrutiny. Bailey stepped closer to examine the gash on my head, his movements precise. As Sherman moved to intervene, trying to place a hand on the doctor's arm, Bailey stopped. He stood up straight, the clinical light hitting his face as he looked directly at Sherman for the first time. The air in the room seemed to thin, leaving us all gasping. "Stafford Sherman." "Stafford," Bailey asked, his voice dropping an octave. Sherman paused, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his face. "Do I know you, doctor? Have we met at a charity function, doctor?" Bailey didn't lower his gaze. He pulled his stethoscope away as if Sherman's very presence was the contagion. He wasn't looking at a prestigious lawyer. He was looking at a ghost. "I remember you," Bailey whispered. "You were the lead counsel for the firm that built the Miller Creek Bridge, the one who buried the safety reports and ensured the families got nothing when the span collapsed 20 years ago. My father was on that bridge, Stafford. For the first time in my life, I saw Sherman look small. He looked like a man standing on a structure that was already falling apart. I remember you perfectly." Sherman tried to adjust his tie, a nervous habit I hadn't seen since the day the old bridge gave way. Silence fell over the room, like a heavy curtain cutting off Sherman's protests as the security guard stepped in to escort him out. The clinical white walls of exam room 4 seemed to expand, finally giving me room to breathe without the suffocating weight of his presence. "Doctor." Bailey and Nurse Carol remained, their faces carved from the same hard stone of professional duty. Bailey didn't waste time. He began a methodical head-to-toe examination, his touch as precise as a draftsman's line. I felt the cold, steady pressure of his fingers on my neck, checking for spinal alignment, then moving down to my torso. He didn't just look at the fresh, blooming purple of the fall. He paused at the old, poorly healed fractures in my ribs and the faint, circular scarring on my wrists that Sherman had always dismissed to the neighbors as clumsiness. "I'm going to touch your ribs now." Wayne Bailey said, his voice dropping the edge it had used on Sherman. "Tell me if the pain is sharp or dull." I looked at the ceiling, the faint smell of ozone from the medical equipment filling my lungs. "It's the kind of pain that comes from being handled like cargo, doctor," I replied. Speaking the truth felt like removing a rusted bolt from a bridge it screeched. It resisted, but once it was out, the whole structure breathed again. Bailey stopped his hands and looked me in the eye. He wasn't looking for signs of a stroke or a fading mind anymore. He was looking for the engineer. "Tell me about the fall," he prompted. I didn't give him a story of tripping on a rug or losing my balance. Instead, I gave him the physics. I described the exact velocity of my descent, the impact points I'd chosen on the foyer marble, and how I'd tucked my shoulder to ensure I'd bleed enough for the police to take notice, but not enough to suffer a traumatic brain injury. I calculated the force of the impact to ensure I'd have the leverage I needed to get out of that house. I told him, my voice scratchy but firm. Bailey's eyes widened slightly. "You staged a structural failure to expose the architect," he whispered. I nodded slowly. "I knew you were the head of the ER here, Elias. I knew you'd never side with a Stafford after what they did to your family." I reached into the hidden fold of my hospital gown and pulled out the burner phone. The blue-tinted light reflected off the screen as I handed it to him. "Everything is on here," I said. "The recordings of Sherman's threats, the photos of the shell companies he's been using to drain my estate, and the paperwork for that facility where they intended to bury me." For the first time in 3 years, nobody was telling me what I felt or what I saw. They were actually listening. Bailey took the phone, his jaw tight as he scrolled through the files. His cold professionalism didn't break, but it hardened into something far more dangerous for Sherman, a resolve for justice. "As a physician, I am a mandatory reporter for elder abuse, Wayne," he said, his voice ringing with a new clarity. "You're not going back to that house. Not today. Not ever." I felt a surge of cathartic release so powerful, my hands began to shake. He reached for the hospital phone on the wall, ready to call the detective in charge of elder abuse cases. "I've been keeping a private file on Sherman's firm for years," he admitted, his eyes fixed on the door. "I was just waiting for a victim strong enough to testify." He started to dial, but before he could finish the third digit, the hospital intercom crackled to life with a frantic electronic burst. "Code Silver ER exam hallway," a voice barked. Code Silver. The sudden jarring blare of the hospital alarm cut through the room, and I knew Sherman had finally run out of lies. The Code Silver announcement didn't just signal a threat. It felt like the house of cards I'd spent weeks shaking was finally beginning to fold in on itself. The sound of a heavy door slamming against a wall echoed from the corridor, followed by a scream of pure, panicked rage. It was Sherman. He was losing the cool, litigious exterior that had been his armor for decades. As muffled, echoing shouts of security guards filled the hallway, Dr. Bailey acted with the clinical efficiency of a soldier. He threw the deadbolt on the exam room door and pulled the thick privacy curtains shut, plunging us into a world of flickering fluorescent lights and claustrophobic dread. He looked at the burner phone in his hand, his fingers trembling slightly as he scrolled through the files. "He's not screaming because he's worried about you," Wayne Bailey whispered, his voice tight. "He's screaming because he knows I'm the one person in this city who can't be bought." I watched him, my heart hammering against my ribs. "How deep does this go, Doctor?" I asked. Bailey didn't look up. "He's a specialist in erasure, making inconvenient people like you vanish into state-sanctioned facilities using paid-off medical experts. It's a surgical strike against the soul. Do you want to know the scariest thing about a man like Sherman? He doesn't break the law. He rewrites it until it fits his hands like a glove. He's been doing this for a long time, Bailey's eyes went dark, fixed on a name in the digital files. He began to tell me about Catherine. She was a former client of Sherman's, a whistleblower, who tried to expose structural fissures in a bridge project years ago. Sherman didn't just defeat her in court, he had her declared mentally unfit. He used a recurring asset, a specific doctor, to sign the commitment papers. Catherine ended up in a private care facility, where she accidentally overdosed 3 months later. My father was the engineer who tried to support her, Bailey said, the clinical smell of his latex gloves sharp as he clenched his fists. Sherman destroyed his reputation with paid witnesses before the bridge even collapsed. Then I saw it, the mid-twist that turned my blood to ice. Bailey pointed to the name of the physician who had signed my own accelerated dementia diagnosis. It was the same man who had disappeared Catherine. This wasn't just a template. It was a signature. Catherine wasn't crazy, and neither are you, Wayne. Sherman just pays the right people to say you are. I felt a shared bond of grief and fury tighten between us. We scrolled further, finding a hidden spreadsheet labeled as a witness ledger. It wasn't just data. It was the blueprint of a ghost factory. It listed names, dates, and exact payment amounts for medical board members and prominent psychologists who had facilitated these illegal conservatorships. This isn't just a theft, Wayne Bailey muttered. This is a business model. My fear crystallized into a hard, calculated resolve. Then we don't just stop him, I said. We burn the whole office down. The witness ledger was the match. The hospital alarm continued to blare, a rhythmic mechanical scream that matched the pounding in my head. Doctor, Bailey started to move a heavy equipment cart toward the door to barricade it, but a sudden frantic knocking stopped him. It wasn't the rhythmic thud of security. It was a sharp, uneven staccato. I looked at the small, reinforced window of the exam room door. Jacqueline's face was pressed against the glass, her skin the color of ash. She wasn't there to help her husband. She looked terrified, her eyes wide with a primal horror I hadn't seen since she was a little girl. Dad, please, she mouthed, her breath fogging the glass. Sherman. He's lost it. He told me if I didn't help him get you out of here right now, he'd dispose of me just like he did the others. Her eyes darted toward the hallway behind her. He's coming, Dad. He's got a gun. The first shot didn't hit the door. It shattered the glass of the nurse's station 20 feet away. The lock clicked, a thin metallic promise of safety that felt laughable against the weight of the man screaming my name in the hall. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the sound of heavy boots and the sharp, jagged breath of Jacqueline outside the door. But then the chaos took a strange turn. I heard the scuffle of security guards and the authoritative shout of Officer Miller, but no second shot followed. Sherman hadn't actually brought a gun. He had intentionally mimicked the draw to trigger a code silver, knowing the resulting liability would paralyze the hospital. He was reaching for a high-tension legal injunction, a roll of paper he wielded like a bludgeon. By the time Miller and the orderlies tackled him, the damage was done. The administration was already on the line, with Sherman's legal team terrified of the scene he'd manufactured. Dr. Bailey tried to block the door, his jaw set in a hard line of defiance. He's a danger to himself and others. Look at him, Bailey roared, pointing at the red-faced man being held against the wall. Sherman just spat on the floor, his eyes fixed on me. I have a court-ordered conservatorship, doctor. You are currently kidnapping my ward, and my lawyers will have your license by sunset. How do you fight a man who owns the paper the law is printed on? The truth is a fragile thing when it's weighed against a notarized lie. The false calm of the lockdown was shattered by the arrival of Dr. Aris Pembroke. He arrived with the smell of expensive tobacco and the manufactured empathy of a man who sold his medical ethics for a corner office and a seat on Sherman's board. His designer suit was a sharp, predatory contrast to Bailey's worn, ink-stained lab coat. Pembroke didn't even look at my injuries. He simply presented a pre-signed emergency transfer order to the hospital administrator, who had appeared behind him. He claimed my fall was a suicide attempt, brought on by late-stage dementia, a narrative he'd been crafting for years. "Doctor, Bailey, your zeal is noted, but you aren't a geriatric psychiatrist," Pembroke said, his perfectly manicured hands adjusting a gold cufflink. "I've treated Mr. Faulkner for years." Bailey stepped forward, his voice a low growl. "You've treated his bank account, Pembroke, not his mind." But the system didn't care about Bailey's ethics. It cared about the paperwork. Despite my lucid pleas and Bailey's forensic evidence, the administrator folded. The threat of a massive lawsuit from Sherman's firm was the final nail. I felt the nylon rasp of the gurney straps against my skin as they began to tie me down. The gurney straps felt like the cold, black fingers of the bridge cables pulling me down into the ravine. I was being recaptured by the very beast I had tried to slay. They wheeled me toward the ER loading bay, the antiseptic sting of the hospital air fading as we approached the humid afternoon heat. Sherman stood over me, the mask of the worried son-in-law back in place for the benefit of the passing staff. "Rest now, Wayne," he whispered, leaning so close I could smell the bile on his breath. "The facility has very quiet rooms for people who tell stories." "You're making a mistake," I screamed, but my voice was drowned out by the vibration of the transport van's engine. In the final seconds of the loading process, Dr. Bailey leaned over me ostensibly to check my pulse. He didn't take the phone. It was already gone, tucked away in his own pocket, but I felt the cold, hard edge of his medical ID badge pressed into my palm. It was a magnetic strip that could bypass certain security locks. "Keep it hidden," he mouthed. The doors of the transport van slammed shut, plunging me into darkness. Sherman sat across from me, the light of his cigar cherry red in the gloom. Now he whispered, "Let's talk about that phone." The van lurched forward, and for a second, I thought the bridge was falling all over again. The darkness of the transport cabin was thick, broken only by the cherry-red glow of Sherman's cigar. He watched me with the predatory patience of a man who had already won. "Do you want to know why I let you keep that burner phone, Wayne?" he asked, a thin smile pulling at his lips. "It was a honeypot. I've been tracing every signal. You didn't send a thing. You were too busy playing hero to actually win." I felt a cold spike of dread, but I kept my face as immobile as the marble statues in my garden. The gravel of my own driveway sounded like grinding teeth under the van's tires, welcoming me back to a prison I once called home. Sherman didn't speak again until the engine died. Two massive men with the blank expressions of professionals paid to ignore the screams of the elderly orderlies hired by Sherman hauled me out into the torrential rain. The water soaked through my thin hospital gown, instantly turning it into a cold, translucent second skin. We bypassed the grand entrance, slipping through the servants' quarters to ensure no prying eyes saw the patriarch of the Faulkner estate being dragged like a sack of grain. "Do you smell that?" Wayne Sherman mocked as we entered the narrow hallway. "That's the smell of a man who lost his only move." I spat a mouthful of rainwater onto the floor. "Bailey won't stop," I rasped. "He knows what you did to Catherine." Sherman's laughter was a sharp, barking sound. "Bailey is currently being investigated by the medical board. My friends have long reaches, old man." Inside the foyer, the air was stale. Sherman performed a systematic purge. He shoved me against a wall, his hands tearing at my gown with a frantic, greedy energy. He searched every fold, every seam, but his arrogance was his blind spot. He felt the prosthetic leg brace and sneered, moving his hands away, as if the plastic were contagious. He never checked the deep torn seam where I had tucked Dr. Bailey's ID badge. He did find the burner phone, though. He held it up like a trophy before dropping it on the marble floor and crushing it under his polished heel. "Is this it? Your grand master plan?" "A plastic toy," he sneered. I looked at the shattered remains. "It's enough to hang you, Sherman," I said, though my voice felt thin. The mansion used to be a symphony of my own design. Now it was a discordant mess of Sherman's greed. Every piece of furniture I had selected, every beam I had calculated, seemed to be turning against me. The mansion had become a gilded cell. I was shoved up the stairs, the cold marble floors unforgiving against my bare feet. When we reached my bedroom, the sharp pain in my hip flared as I was thrown onto the bed. I noticed the changes immediately. The windows had been fitted with subtle steel grills on the outside, disguised as decorative ironwork. Sherman stood in the doorway, the dim yellow light of the hall swallowing his silhouette. "Say goodbye to the view, Wayne. Tomorrow morning you're going to the Heights. Where you're going, the walls don't have windows." "I'm not leaving this house," I replied, staring at the ceiling. "Not the way you think." Click. The sound of the lock was a period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. The light from the hallway vanished as the door slammed. I sat in the absolute darkness, the rain lashing against the new iron grills like 1,000 tiny hammers. I reached into the seam of my brace and pulled out the ID badge. Using the faint glow of the storm, I saw a tiny handwritten note on the back. "Check the vents. 1982. My heart skipped. Sherman thought he had stripped me of everything, but he forgot the one thing an engineer never loses: the exit strategy. I knew exactly what was in those vents. I had built the structural bypass myself 40 years ago. I crawled toward the air vent, my fingers trembling as they found the hidden latch I hadn't touched since the year the bridge was completed. The vent cover didn't groan. I had oiled those hinges a lifetime ago for a day just like this. Layer upon layer of 40-year-old dust filled my throat, but the sensation of cold metal touching my fingertips was sweeter than any breath of pure oxygen. I reached deeper into the structural bypass, my arm straining against the narrow confines of the ductwork until I felt the crinkle of heavy plastic. It was a vacuum-sealed package anchored into a hollow I had designed during the original build in 1982. Inside, I found my true second lifeline. The burner phone Sherman had crushed with such theatrical malice on the marble floor earlier was nothing but a decoy, a shiny lure I had dangled to feed his arrogant sense of dominance. The real prize had been waiting here all along, placed by Lorraine during one of her clandestine visits to my bedroom under the guise of fluffing my pillows. Along with the sleek black device, there was a hand-drawn electrical schematic of the mansion annotated in her sharp, precise script that mirrored my own engineering notes. "Thank you, Lorraine," I whispered into the stale metallic air of the crawlspace. "You always saw the structural fissures in this family before I did." I pulled myself back into the room and sat on the edge of the bed, the torrential rain hammering against the roof like a relentless war drum. My fingers gnarled but steady trembled slightly as I powered on the device. The blue glow of the screen was a cold, piercing light in the absolute darkness of my bedroom. A single encrypted message waited from an unknown sender. It read, "Remember Freedom Day. The code is the first bridge." My mind flickered the shadows of my diagnosis, threatening to swallow the memory whole. My memories are like a network of old concrete crumbling in gray, but today a current of truth was surging through the rebar, burning away the moss of confusion. I reached for that specific anchor. Freedom Day wasn't a holiday for the masses. It was the specific date I signed the contract for the heaviest suspension bridge of my career. June 4th, 1982. The code was 040682. Lorraine was using the very history Sherman dismissed as senile ramblings to build my final escape hatch. I entered the digits into a hidden banking application on the phone, the keys clicking softly under my touch. Instead of a balance sheet, it initiated a digital handshake that bypassed the mansion's proprietary security. Suddenly, I had a god-eye view of my own home through the high-definition lenses I had paid for. Lorraine had successfully backdoored the entire camera system. On the small screen, I watched Sherman in the living room far below. He was pouring a glass of expensive scotch, his shoulders relaxed in a posture of smug victory. He looked like a man who thought he had finally tamed the architect and occupied the castle. Do you really think you are the master of this house, Sherman? I thought a cold, sharp smile touching my lips. Let me show you who laid the first stone and wired the last circuit. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to watch your enemy celebrate a hollow victory through a tiny, glowing screen? It is a patient, freezing kind of satisfaction that warms the blood. I toggled to the hallway camera outside my door. The flickering light revealed Jacqueline standing by the threshold. She looked broken, her face a mask of guilt, as she checked the corridor for her husband. She knelt quickly, sliding something small and metallic under the hallway rug, a master override key. She was finally choosing a side at the 11th hour. I checked the system diagnostics. The override command was primed. I touched the screen, ready to trigger the global electrical blackout I had built into the house's emergency failsafe. Thunder shook the foundations of the estate, a roar of nature that masked the electronic chirp of my unauthorized access. I pressed the command. Outside, a bolt of lightning split the sky, and for a heartbeat, every light in the Faulkner mansion flickered and died, leaving only the blue ghost of my screen to light the way. Darkness wasn't my enemy. It was an ally I had designed for myself 4 decades ago. In this house, shadows are not a lack of light, but a blueprint drawn in soot. I watched the blue ghost of my phone screen as I initiated the overload gambit. I didn't just turn off the lights. I commanded the electrical heart of the mansion to suffer a calculated seizure. Following the sequence Lorraine provided, I forced a surge through the sub-panels I had installed in 1982. The first explosion was muffled, coming from the basement, followed by a rhythmic series of sharp cracks that sounded like a firing squad in the foyer. The smell of burning insulation and ozone began to bleed through the vents. This power failure was a key to a different kind of door. You see, I had built magnetic relays into certain wall panels that only disengage when the current dies completely. The mansion was opening its secret veins to me. Upstairs, I heard Sherman's muffled roar of confusion. What the hell is going on? Check the panels now. He screamed, his voice cracking with a fear that warmed my cold blood. It's falling apart, Sherman, I whispered into the dark. This house is finally rejecting you. I slid out of bed, my bare feet meeting the freezing marble floor. Every step was a lesson in pain, but the adrenaline acting as my cane was stronger than any sedative. I crawled toward the door, my movements guided by the rhythmic flashes of lightning outside that illuminated my haggard reflection in the hallway mirrors. I reached the spot where Jacqueline had stood. My fingers swept the rough fabric of the rug until they brushed against something cold and jagged. The master key. Before I reveal the detail that changes everything about the distraction gambit, if you're still watching this unfold with me, comment justice or revenge and add one short reason why you picked that side. Please note, what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes, as the emotional truth behind this betrayal is what I hope stays with you. My phone buzzed in my hand, mirrored by a frantic ringtone from the living room below. It was Dr. Bailey executing the strike we had rehearsed in the quiet corners of the hospital. Through the internal line, I could hear him bluffing with the cold precision of a surgeon. He claimed to be standing in the prosecutor's office with the original burner phone, the decoy Sherman thought he had destroyed. Bailey gave him 15 minutes before the sirens would crest the hill. Sherman, already unmoored by the house, screaming in electrical agony, broke. I heard his heavy boots thumping toward the garage, followed by the screech of tires as his security detail tore away into the storm. The fortress was suddenly unnervingly empty. The only sounds left were the drumming rain and the distant haunting sound of Jacqueline sobbing somewhere in the foyer. I didn't head for the stairs. I turned back toward Sherman's study, the tick-tock of the grandfather clock there sounding like a countdown. My mind was focused on the original bridge collapse files, the documents that Catherine died trying to protect. I reached his heavy oak desk, my eyes catching the silhouette of a massive floor safe in the corner. I had assumed he carried the secrets with him, but he was too arrogant to think I could ever reach them. I knelt before the steel beast, the smell of old paper, and Sherman's expensive tobacco thick in the air. The irony was a physical weight. The combination to the vault that held my destruction was the one date I could never forget: Catherine's birthday. My fingers trembled as I touched the keypad. The first number, the second. The hall was like the throat of a dead monster, and I was the last bone sticking in its gullet. Suddenly, the click of a hammer cocking back echoed in the silent room, a cylinder of cold steel pressed firmly against the base of my skull. "You shouldn't have done this, Dad." Jacqueline whispered, her voice devoid of its usual tremor. Jacqueline didn't flinch. The barrel of the gun remained as motionless as the blind loyalty she had cultivated for her husband. I didn't turn around. I kept my gaze fixed on the safe's keypad, my fingers hovering over the numbers. I wasn't afraid of the cold kiss of lead. I was only afraid of the rot I had glimpsed in the eyes of the daughter I once carried in my arms. "You won't pull that trigger, Jackie," I said, my voice barely a whisper above the drumming rain outside. "You're Catherine's daughter, not his. You left me that master key tonight because some part of you still knows the truth." Her breath hitched a jagged sound in the silent room. "You don't understand." She rasped, the gun pressing harder against my skull. "Sherman says you've lost your mind, that your delusions will burn down everything we've built. He's protecting us from you." I laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "He's protecting his throne, Jackie. Ask yourself why your mother was so desperate to reach that bridge the night she died. She wasn't running to me. She was running away from the lies he forced into the foundation." I finished the sequence: Catherine's birthday. The heavy steel door of the safe didn't swing open. It clicked and retracted with a hiss of pressurized air. What is the price of loyalty when it is built on the ashes of 1,000 deceptions? I looked inside, but there were no stacks of paper, no ledgers or blueprints. Instead, there was an old 8mm film projector and a single canister of film labeled Project 81KV7, Appendix. The sight of it made the air in the room feel thin and metallic. Jacqueline lowered the weapon, the cold metal of the frame clattering as it grazed the desk. She slumped against the mahogany, her eyes wide with a realization that began to erode her resolve. "I've known about this place for so long," she confessed, her voice trembling. "But I was too terrified to look. I even swapped the rounds in this gun for blanks before I came in here. I couldn't do it, Dad. But I didn't know he kept this. Why would he keep this?" "It's a trophy," I replied, picking up the film canister. "Sherman doesn't just win. He preserves the moment of his enemy's defeat. This tape isn't about her death, though. It's about the concrete. It's about why she had to be silenced. I didn't just stand there. I knew the architecture of this room better than the man who currently paid the taxes on it. I took the film reel and placed it into a specific indentation on the bookshelf, then gripped the Faulkner family crest carved into the mantel, and rotated it 45 degrees. The sound of hydraulic fluid coursing through hidden pipes filled the study. Slowly, the floorboards beneath the heavy desk slid back, revealing a steep stone staircase plunging into a darkness that no modern map of this estate ever recorded. The basement opened like an old wound of the house, inviting me back to the pain I had tried to bury for decades. "Stay here," I commanded, turning to Jacqueline. "If you hear him return, you lock this door and you don't let him in. No matter what he says, I'll try," she stammered, her face pale in the weak beam of my flashlight. "Just hurry." I stepped onto the first stair. This descent wasn't just a hallway. I had designed it as a gravity trap. Once I closed the hatch from the inside, the magnetic locks would only respond to my own biometric signature, a final safeguard against the world above. I descended, the air growing heavy with the smell of damp earth and oxidized steel. My boots rang out on the stone steps, echoing in the void. At the bottom, my light swept across rusted iron shelves until it settled on a raised pedestal in the center of the room. There, encased in a plexiglass shroud, sat the concrete core sample from Bridge Pier number 4, the piece of earth and stone Catherine gave her life to protect. The concrete block didn't look like a piece of evidence. It looked like a stone coffin sitting in the center of my hidden sanctuary. My flashlight beam trembled as it settled on the gray, abrasive surface of the slab, where hairline fractures spread like a map leading toward the lies Catherine had tried so desperately to warn me about. I reached out my palm, brushing the cold grit of Bridge Pier number 4. Beneath the central pedestal, I found a fireproof steel box partially buried under a pile of old blueprints. I pried it open to find a blue leather-bound journal and a vintage handheld tape recorder. The scent of decaying paper and dry leather hit me, the smell of a life interrupted. I opened the journal to the final entry, recognizing Catherine's sharp engineering script. A hand that shared my own meticulous habits. Even through the veil of my diagnosis, the horror of her words sliced through me. She hadn't died in a random structural failure. Catherine had discovered that Sherman was swapping out load-bearing materials for inferior alloys to skim millions from Project 81 KV7. My daughter hadn't just been an accidental victim. She had been systematically poisoned with the same memory-eroding sedatives Sherman was currently forcing on me. A way to discredit her before he staged that fatal night on the bridge. If I do not survive tonight, look into the core of Pier number 4, she had written. The ink was still so sharp, so hauntingly alive. Sherman didn't just kill people. I whispered, my voice thick with a freezing rage. He killed the very soul of the architecture I spent my life building. My daughter's voice crept through the layers of dust and time, sounding like the scream of tearing metal. It was the sound of truth coming due. I pressed play on the recorder. Static hissed before the sharp, defiant voice of Catherine Faulkner filled the small room. She sounded exactly as I remembered, possessed by the brilliance of an engineer and a fierce love for my legacy. You can't do this, Sherman. My father put his entire life into that bridge. Her voice was a whip cracking against the low, predatory growl of Sherman Stafford. Your father is old, Catherine, he had countered, the arrogance in his tone making my skin crawl. He'll only remember what I tell him to remember. A few cracks aren't worth millions in profit. It was the smoking gun, the admission, that turned a tragedy into a cold-blooded assassination. The concrete block on the pedestal wasn't just a sample. It was a hollowed-out vault. I felt along the base until my fingers found a microchip, hidden within a small borehole, a backup of the original design data Sherman had scrubbed from our servers. As I tucked the chip and the journal into my inner pocket, the hydraulic system of the basement hummed with a sudden, violent vibration. Boom. The door at the top of the stairs was kicked open. Sherman was back. The distraction hadn't held him long enough. I could hear his footsteps thudding directly above my head, heavy and erratic like a wounded predator. Time was gone. A muffled, metallic screech followed the sound of Sherman using a crowbar to pry at the floorboards of the study, trying to force the mechanism I had built. Stay focused. Wayne, I told myself, feeling the fog of the house trying to settle over my mind one last time. Don't let the shadows win. My flashlight flickered, the batteries dying just as the light caught a dark red switch hidden beneath the lip of the concrete pedestal. It was labeled in my own handwriting from 1982, Emergency Load Shed. The floor above groaned under the weight of Sherman's fury. I heard him scream my name through the vents, a sound of pure, unadulterated malice. I looked at the recorder where the tape was still spinning, revealing one final betrayal. The man helping Sherman stage Catherine's accident was Dr. Pembroke, the very physician who had just forced me back into this prison. I reached for the red switch. This house was built on a foundation of betrayal, and the time has finally come for that structure to suffer a catastrophic load failure. Truth is not just an abstract concept. Sometimes it weighs exactly $500,000 and smells like fresh ink on a life insurance policy. As I knelt in the dust of the secret basement, my flashlight beam snagged on a thick manila envelope wedged behind the concrete core of Pier number 4. I pulled it free, the paper stiff and cold. It was a secret life insurance policy Sherman had taken out on Catherine only 3 months before the bridge went down. A double indemnity clause for engineering failure. He hadn't just murdered her to cover his tracks. He had harvested her life for the capital he needed to swallow my company whole. $500,000. He sold my daughter's life for the price of a luxury condo. You calculated every single decimal point, didn't you, Sherman? The screech of metal above was deafening now, a sharp, rhythmic groaning as the crowbar bit deeper into the floorboards. I could hear the acrid sizzle and smell the pungent sting of industrial acid. He was pouring a corrosive agent into the seams of the trapdoor to eat through the locking mechanism I had spent my youth perfecting. My hands, normally steady as a surveyor's tripod, shook as I fumbled with the second burner phone. I began a frantic digital race, snapping photos of every page in the journal, the insurance contract, and the flawed concrete core. The signal in this tomb was nearly non-existent, the thick reinforced walls acting as a Faraday cage. I had to move. Have you ever felt the last 1% of a battery charge stretch out like an entire century? That is my reality in this suffocating dark. I pressed myself against the narrow ventilation shaft, the only place where a ghost of a signal might drift in from the stormy night above. I could hear Jacqueline screaming in the study, her voice a thin wire of panic. "Run, Dad. He's going to kill you." I watched the blue status bar on the screen crawl with agonizing slowness. Uploading 80%. 85. I haven't just sent this to Dr. Bailey Sherman. I have set a dead man's switch. If I don't input a safety code every 10 minutes, this entire cache of evidence automatically posts to the Stafford Construction homepage. The world is about to see exactly what kind of monster you are. The ceiling groaned one last time, a sound of structural surrender. A section of the floorboards didn't just open, it disintegrated under the weight of Sherman's fury. A cascade of splintered oak and plaster dust rained down on me, coating my lungs in the taste of my own home's destruction. Sherman jumped through the jagged hole, landing like a heavy predatory beast. He held a blood-stained crowbar in one hand, his eyes crimson with a rage that transcended reason. "I'll take that phone from your corpse, you senile old man," he roared, lunging forward through the haze. The sound of the floor crumbling was the final standing ovation this house gave to its true master. I stood my ground, my back against the central pedestal, my left hand hovering over the red emergency load shed switch. I didn't flinch as he closed the distance. "Too late, Sherman. The data is gone. You're already a ghost." I slammed my palm onto the red button. This switch was never meant to destroy evidence. It was the final fail-safe of a cautious man. A deafening hiss filled the small chamber as compressed carbon dioxide began to vent from the wall recesses in a blinding white cloud. The gas surged forward, a freezing fog that displaced the very air we needed to breathe. Sherman stumbled, his roar turning into a wet, strangled wheeze as the oxygen vanished. He swung the crowbar blindly through the white mist. Darkness rushed in to meet me before I could see if his desperate strike found its mark. The hiss of compressed gas gradually receded, replaced by the distant wailing siren of a police cruiser cutting through the stagnant night air. Death has no flavor other than silence, but a blood debt always carries the heavy metallic tang of rusted iron and betrayal. I woke on the cold floor of the vault, my lungs burning as if I had swallowed glass. The white fog of CO2 was thinning, but my vision remained a fractured mosaic of gray shadows. A searing heat radiated from my shoulder where the crowbar had struck me. I looked back and realized the heavy iron tool hadn't just hit me. It had embedded itself into the auxiliary power panel behind my head, shearing through the casing. Sparks showered down like dying stars, and the sharp smell of ozone told me a live current was now searching for a path through the damp air. Sherman was already crawling toward me, coughing violently, his face a mask of primal fury. I ignored the agony in my arm and lunged for the microchip that had skittered across the concrete floor during the impact. My fingers closed around the tiny plastic square, just as a heavy boot slammed into my ribs. "You can't win, you old ghost Sherman," wheezed his voice, sounding like two stones grinding together. I rolled onto my back, tasting the salt of my own blood. "I won the moment I stopped being afraid of you," I replied, staring directly into the abyss of his eyes. Sherman regained his footing, retrieving the crowbar with a sickening scrape against the floor. He began to circle me like a predator that knew its prey was cornered. He let out a low, jagged laugh, mocking the very idea of the evidence I had just uploaded. "Do you know the feeling of realizing the man who has sat at your dinner table for a decade is actually a demon in a tailor-made suit?" He looked down at the old cassette recorder of Catherine's that lay between us. "Do you honestly think justice is free, Wayne? It's a commodity. I buy investigators like I buy lumber. I own the narrative." To punctuate his point, he brought the heel of his boot down on the recorder. The plastic shattered, and the tape inside the voice of my daughter was ground into the dirt under his weight. My rage wasn't a fire. It was a cold, structural shift. I felt the slight vibration beneath my feet, a rhythmic thrumming from the hydraulic lines I had activated with a hidden kick switch near the pedestal. Sherman didn't notice. He was too intoxicated by his own perceived invincibility. He backed me against the massive concrete sample of Pier Number 4, his shadow stretching across the wall like a bloated titan. Screech. The sound of metal dragging on the floor. Closer. Closer now. Before I show you the final collapse of this man's ego, are you still with me? Comment 1. And add one short reason why you think Sherman's power will or won't save him now. Please note the next part includes some fictionalized details added to deepen the emotional impact and convey the core message. What matters is the lesson behind it. Sherman raised the crowbar high, his face twisted in a sneer of absolute contempt. "Clever men still die, Wayne, and you've been far too clever for your own good." I didn't tremble. I watched the flickering light of the broken bulb overhead and thought about resonance. The weakest part of a structure isn't the concrete, I told him, it's your own arrogance. You didn't just kill Catherine for money, did you? You wanted it all. Sherman smiled a thin, cruel line. She wouldn't play her part. And if Jacqueline doesn't learn to value her inheritance more than your life, she'll be next. That admission was the final bolt in his coffin. Sherman swung. The whistle of the iron bar split the air near my ear. I didn't dodge. I closed my eyes not to hide, but to count the final surging vibrations of the house's heavy machinery. I felt the floor groan, ready to surrender. The earth didn't just shake. It groaned under the staggering weight of the truth. The whistle of the iron bar split the air mere millimeters from my ear, but the ground beneath Sherman's feet had already begun to betray him. I wasn't lunging toward the stairs. Instead, I had lured him exactly where I needed him to be, right beside the flawed concrete core sample of Pier Number 4. My foot had found the manual override for the vibration testing rig built into the floor, a relic of my old lab days. As I rolled to the left, the stone floor beneath Sherman began to thrum at a precise, low-frequency hum. It was the resonance of a failing foundation. Dust and pulverized stone erupted from the ceiling, blinding him for a crucial second. "What are you doing, you old bastard?" Sherman roared, his balance faltering as the slab beneath him shuddered. "Are you trying to bring the whole house down?" I pulled myself up my shoulder, screaming in protest, and looked him in the eye. "Only the parts that don't deserve to stand, Sherman. This isn't just noise. It's the sound of your own architecture turning against you." The rhythm intensified, matching the structural frequency of the cracked concrete next to him. A large chunk of plaster fell from above, striking him on the shoulder, and for the first time, I saw the flicker of genuine terror in his gaze as he realized I was turning the entire basement into a living trap. Snap. Crackle. That wasn't the sound of bone. It was the sound of the foundation surrendering. Sherman lunged again, but the floor was no longer a stable platform. We collided in a brutal, uncoordinated struggle. He was younger and stronger, but I was fueled by a decade of suppressed grief. The air was thick with the smell of dry, crushed concrete and the ozone from the short-circuited panel. He gripped my throat, his thumbs pressing into my windpipe, but I reached down and drove my elbow into his left knee, the one he'd had reconstructed after a skiing accident years ago. He buckled with a howl of pain, his grip loosening just enough for me to scramble away. I grabbed a heavy brass transit from a nearby shelf and swung it with everything I had left, striking the side of his head. We were two ghosts fighting in a tomb of our own making. "I'll break your neck with my bare hands," he spat, clutching his bleeding temple. I stared at him, my lips split, and the taste of salt heavy on my tongue. "You broke this family a long time ago." Every blow I landed felt like a brick being removed from his empire. I saw my chance and moved toward the stone stairs, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. But as I reached the first step, a massive shadow blocked the exit. Have you ever seen a devil in a three-piece suit? Craig was that man. Craig was a man with a face so blandly forgettable, it was almost a mask. But his silence and those oversized hands radiated the cold lethality of a professional cleaner. He stood at the top of the stairs, a suppressed handgun held with casual precision. He didn't look shocked by the chaos below. He looked like he was checking a grocery list. "Craig," Sherman barked, pulling himself up by the edge of the pedestal. "Kill this old man and get rid of the body. I'll handle Jacqueline." Craig didn't move. He didn't even aim at me. Instead, he stepped down into the vibrating room and handed Sherman a compact aluminum briefcase. "The warrant for your arrest was signed 10 minutes ago, Mr. Stafford." Craig said, his voice as flat as a dial tone. "The local authorities are 4 minutes out. I'm not here to clean up Wayne. I'm here to get you to the airstrip." He nudged the suitcase toward Sherman, revealing a stack of cold cash and a set of forged passports. The betrayal in the room shifted. Sherman stared at the case, his triumph curdling into the desperation of a cornered rat. Craig glanced at his watch, and then looked over at me, his dark eyes fixed and unblinking. "Mr. Stafford, we have 5 minutes," he said coldly. "But I hate witnesses who are still breathing." Task 7.3. The barrel of Craig's suppressed weapon did not waver, held with the same cold mechanical certainty that death itself employs when it arrives exactly on schedule. In those final seconds, the most terrifying sound wasn't a gunshot, but the absolute silence of a hired killer calculating the precise trajectory of a bullet meant for my skull. I felt the vibration of the burner phone in my pocket before I heard it. It was a violent, insistent buzzing. I fumbled for it, clicking the speaker on as the voice of Dr. Bailey erupted through the basement. The sound was amplified unnaturally, echoing off the damp concrete walls with the authority of an oracle. Craig dropped the weapon. Bailey's voice boomed. "Your name was added to the federal red notice list 10 minutes ago. Every byte of data Wayne uploaded is currently being processed by the Department of Justice. State police have the perimeter of the estate sealed. You are holding a gun in a room that has become a broadcast studio." I realized then that Bailey had done more than just take the call. He had bypassed the mansion's smart speaker system, piping this confrontation directly onto every social platform connected to Stafford Construction. "Sherman, you have nowhere left to run. The world is watching you in high definition." Sherman's face contorted into something subhuman. The desperation in his eyes turned a muddy, sickly yellow. He snatched the handgun from Craig's grip, his fingers trembling with a frantic, unhinged energy. He pointed the weapon at me, his chest heaving. "It was you and your obsessive, rigid rules. You killed Catherine by making her just as stubborn as you." I stared back at him, my heart finding a strange, rhythmic calm amidst the chaos. "You killed her for a double indemnity payout and a seat at the head of a table that didn't belong to you, Sherman." Don't blame the architecture for the rot in your own soul. 10 seconds of silence followed. 10 seconds where I could hear the microscopic sound of dust settling on my shoulders and the distant rhythmic wail of sirens growing louder, weaving through the storm outside. Sherman's finger tightened on the trigger, his knuckles white. I could see Craig shifting his weight, his professional instincts telling him that his employer was no longer a client, but a liability. The sirens were close now, their blue and red pulses beginning to flicker through the narrow ventilation slits near the ceiling, painting the room in the colors of an emergency ward. Sherman didn't care. He was lost in the wreckage of his own making a man trying to shoot the mirror because he didn't like the reflection. Bang! A single shot tore through the heavy air. The sound was deafening in the confined space, followed by the acrid, biting scent of cordite. It wasn't me who fell. It wasn't Sherman who had fired. I looked toward the staircase to see Jacqueline Stafford standing in the shadows, her face pale as marble, her hands gripping the small revolver she had once used to threaten me. She hadn't missed. The bullet had caught Craig in the upper thigh, sending the fixer tumbling to the ground. She stepped into the dim light of the basement, the barrel of her gun now fixed squarely on her husband's chest. "Drop it, Sherman!" She screamed, her voice cracking, but her aim remains true. "I heard the tapes. I heard everything you said about me about my sister. If you even twitch, the next one goes through your head." Sherman froze the handgun slipping from his nerveless fingers and clattering onto the debris-strewn floor. Craig, recognizing the game was over, suddenly lunged upward and struck Sherman across the back of the neck with a brutal, short-handed blow. My son-in-law collapsed like a building with a severed spine. Craig stayed on the floor, hands raised, choosing a plea deal over a suicide mission. Jacqueline collapsed beside me, her hands ice-cold as they gripped my arm. "Dad," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the darkness behind Sherman. "This house, it's actually coming down." Debris and white dust blanketed everything like a final shroud for the secrets of the Stafford bloodline. The thunder of boots hitting the hardwood floor above drowned out the groans of pillars buckling under the weight of the truth. As the basement ceiling began to spiderweb with deep terminal cracks, I realized the police hadn't just arrived because of Bailey's broadcast. Decades ago, when I designed the blueprints for this mansion, I had wired a silent distress protocol directly into the foundation's structural sensors, linked straight to the county precinct. The moment the basement's load-bearing integrity dropped below 70%, the silent alarm had tripped. Smoke from flashbangs upstairs mingled with the fine concrete silt, creating a ghost-filled haze as SWAT teams breached the perimeter. "Hold on to me, Mr. Faulkner. Keep your head down, and don't look back," an extraction officer shouted over the roar of a collapsing archway. Two rescuers gripped my shoulders, hauling me toward the service lift, just as a massive section of the study floor above gave way, plunging a mahogany desk and a rain of splintered oak into the pit where Sherman and Craig had stood. Jacqueline was already ahead of me, her hand reaching back, her face a mask of terror and relief. "Dad, we're out!" she cried, her voice barely audible over the structural death rattle. As they pulled me through the threshold of the house I once loved, I felt a hollow ache in my chest. Every timber in this place was soaked in memories of my wife and Catherine, and now it was all returning to the earth. The blue and red lights of the emergency vehicles danced against the brick walls, looking like fireflies celebrating on the corpse of a magnificent lie. It was a carnival of light amidst a wreckage of darkness. I watched as the officers dragged Sherman Stafford out of the side entrance. He was no longer the titan of industry, no longer the groomed successor. His silk shirt was shredded, his face caked in gray dust and dried blood. He looked stunned, the vacant stare of a man who had watched his empire evaporate in a single hour. Flashbulbs from the press, tipped off by Bailey's leak, strobed like lightning strikes across his path. "You have nothing. This is a setup," he screamed, though his voice lacked its usual bite. An officer shoved him toward a cruiser leaning in close. "Shut it, Stafford." The whole world just watched you confess on a live stream. You're the most famous murderer in the country right now. Satisfaction is a cold, sharp blade, and finally, it was cutting in my favor. They laid me on a stretcher near an ambulance, the cold night air biting at my lungs. Doctor. Bailey appeared through the throng of uniforms, placing a steadying hand on my good shoulder. We did it, Wayne. He whispered, his eyes weary but bright. Catherine can finally rest. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing the hard edges of the microchip. The weight of it was more than just plastic and silicone. It was the final nail in Sherman's coffin. The bridge Bailey I rasped as the paramedics began to secure my straps. Rebuild it with real concrete this time. No more ghosts. Everything ended. Or perhaps it was only the beginning of a much larger nightmare. As the ambulance doors prepared to swing shut, I caught a glimpse of Sherman near his transport. He wasn't looking at the cameras anymore. He was looking at me, and he was smiling a jagged, haunting grin that made the hair on my neck stand up. He tilted his head toward a sleek black sedan idling at the far edge of the police cordon. A figure inside, obscured by tinted glass, gave a sharp, clinical nod to Sherman before the car accelerated away. I saw the emblem on the license plate just as it vanished into the dark, the crest of the Federal Bridge Oversight Board. My blood turned to ice. The infection went deeper than one man's greed. The hospital smelled of sterile promises and new beginnings. But my mind remained trapped in the wreckage of the Stafford estate. 6 months later, the scent of antiseptic has been replaced by the heavy odor of oak and floor polish. The courtroom floor is polished to such a mirror finish that I can see my own reflection. As I walk toward the witness stand, a fragile-looking old man carrying the weight of a collapsed bridge in his heart. I took my seat under the sharp, vigilant gaze of Judge Miller. She is a woman in her 60s with short silver hair and eyes as keen as a surgical razor, famously known for tolerating no deception in her sanctuary. To my right sat Sherman Stafford, still wearing his custom-tailored arrogance like a suit of armor, though his eyes burned with a concentrated, quiet venom. Behind him in the gallery sat several men in identical black suits, their presence as chilling and anonymous as the car I had seen on that final rainy night at the mansion. My pulse quickened when I looked at the defense table. Marcus Thorne Sherman's attorney had the oily smile and confident stride of a man who knew he held the winning hand. As he moved to adjust his papers, I felt a jolt of recognition that nearly stole my breath. Thorne was once my father's junior assistant, the man who had vanished years ago along with the original structural designs for the 81 KV7 project. "Are you ready to be sworn in, mister?" Faulkner Judge Miller asked, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "I have waited 10 long, agonizing years for this moment, Your Honor," I replied, my voice steady despite the ghosts crowding the room. "Do you believe a court is a temple where justice always reigns supreme? In reality, it is often a stage for the most meticulously crafted and expensive dramas." I sat on the witness stand, my fingers tracing the cold, unforgiving grain of the wood as Marcus Thorne approached me like a wolf sensing a hidden weakness. He began his cross-examination with a predatory grace, attempting to weaponize my medical history against me in front of the jury. "Mr. Faulkner," he said, his voice dripping with feigned nauseating concern, "given your advanced age and the severe trauma of that night, can you truly be certain you aren't confusing grim reality with a fever dream?" I leaned forward, meeting his gaze with the clarity of a structural blueprint. "Numbers do not dream, Mr. Thorne. Gravity does not lie. The tension at the 81 KV7 support piers exceeded the safety threshold by 15% because of subgrade concrete that Sherman approved. I remember the measurements because they are etched into my conscience, not just my memory." I countered his jabs with the precision of a master builder, citing load-bearing specs and chemical compositions down to the millimeter. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with the smell of old paper and the hum of fluorescent lights. Click, The projector hummed to life, casting a stark white glow across the wood paneling. The past flickered onto the screen, painfully sharp and impossible to ignore. It was time for the digital revelation. I presented the files from the microchip. Catherine's voice filled the room, trembling but heavy with the weight of her discovery. Then came the recording from the basement. Sherman's own voice, cold and detached, admitting to the material cuts that had led to the collapse. The admission hung in the air like the bitter smell of cordite after a gunshot. Sherman's face turned a sickly, ashen shade of gray as the gallery erupted in hushed whispers. I looked directly into his eyes, feeling the first true breath of justice in a decade. However, as I prepared to step down, Thorne held up a single yellowed sheet of paper. "One moment, Mr. Faulkner. I have a document here from 15 years ago, signed by you, where you personally admit that all design flaws in the 81KV7 were results of your own professional negligence, not corporate policy." My eyes locked onto the ancient parchment. The signature at the bottom was a perfect, terrifying imitation of my own. I never signed that. But how do you prove a lie that has been curated with such surgical precision for over a decade? My heart drummed against my ribs as I stared at that forged signature. It was an uncanny, chilling mimicry of my own hand, a ghost of a gesture I never made. But the truth is like reinforced concrete. You can try to paint over it with lies, but the core structure will always crack under pressure. I took a slow, deliberate breath, steadying the trembling in my fingers. Marcus Thorne stood there with a victor's smirk, believing he had just delivered the killing blow. He didn't know that I had found a hidden encrypted file in Catherine's microchip months ago that referenced this very document. I had been waiting for him to play this card, a calculated gamble to destroy the defense's credibility in one fell swoop. I looked up at Judge Miller and calmly requested that a high-resolution microscope and a chemical spectrometer be brought to the stand. "This ink," I said, my voice echoing with a cold clarity that silenced the room, "is a modern gel-based polymer. It contains a synthetic pigment that was not patented or manufactured until the year 2022. Unless I am a time traveler who visited my own past to sign a confession of negligence, this document is an insult to this court and to justice itself." "Doctor." Bailey stepped forward to present the optical analysis on the overhead monitor, the cold blue light illuminating the sheer impossibility of Thorne's evidence. The lawyer's face drained of color as the murmurs in the gallery turned into a roar of indignation. Thorne sputtered an objection about unfounded speculation, but it was a desperate, hollow sound. "What does victory taste like?" It wasn't the sweetness I had imagined during those long, bitter years of exile. Instead, it tasted of ash and the irrevocable loss of time that could never be reclaimed. The room felt heavy with the collective breath of the spectators as the jury filed back in after 3 hours of deliberation. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and the electric hum of the courthouse lights. When the foreman stood and pronounced the words, "Guilty on all counts, first-degree murder insurance fraud and criminal safety violations," a wave of sound crashed over us. Jacqueline sat a few feet away, her head bowed into her shaking hands, finally acknowledging that the man she had called her husband was nothing more than a predatory phantom. Sherman Stafford stood motionless, a bead of cold sweat rolling down his temple as Judge Miller lowered her gavel with a strike that sounded like a falling beam. "Sherman Stafford, this court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole," she declared. Sherman's eyes snapped to mine, filled with a primal, cornered rage. "This isn't over, Wayne. You have no idea who you're really fighting," he hissed, his composure finally shattering into jagged pieces. Clink. The sound of steel cuffs locking around his wrists was the final punctuation mark on his empire. As the officers began to haul him away, Sherman struggled, his eyes searching the gallery for the men in black suits, but their seats were already empty. They had discarded him like a broken tool. I stood up, feeling 100 tons of weight lift from my shoulders, yet Sherman's parting threat lingered in my mind, like a new fissure in the pavement. As Sherman was led through the heavy steel doors, Marcus Thorne leaned in close to me, his breath smelling of stale coffee. "That paper wasn't Sherman's idea, Wayne," he whispered, his eyes darting toward the exit. "It was sent by an organization to see if you were still sharp enough to matter. Keep your eyes open." He turned and vanished into the crowd before I could respond. As I turned to leave, I spotted a pen on the floor, likely dropped in the chaos. I reached down to pick it up, noticing a faint, unnatural texture on the barrel. Under the harsh light, I saw a string of laser-etched coordinates: 40.7128 degrees north, 74.0060 degrees west. The location of the next bridge. The courthouse doors had finally swung shut behind me, but the ledger of Catherine's death still held one unturned page. Peace is not the absence of conflict, but the newfound ability to sit amidst the ruins of the past, without feeling the old tremors in my bones. 2 months had passed since the verdict, and the summer heat now lay heavy over the city. I found myself at a quiet riverside tea house, the scent of chamomile drifting through the air as I waited. When Jacqueline arrived, she looked different. The sharp, defensive edges of her personality had been smoothed away by a somber humility. We didn't discuss the trial or the life sentence Sherman was now serving. Instead, we talked about Catherine. I watched her hands tremble slightly as she reached for her cup, her eyes never quite meeting mine until she spoke. "I was blind, Dad," she whispered, the riverside wind carrying her words across the table. "I let a monster into our home because I wanted to believe in the beautiful sketches he showed me." "I don't blame you, Jackie," I replied, reaching across the table to cover her hand with my own. We were both fooled by grand designs that lacked a soul. I reached into my bag and pulled out a rolled bundle of yellowed vellum, a portion of the original uncorrupted blueprints I had kept hidden for decades. "This is your legacy," I said, handing it to her and feeling the rough, familiar texture of the paper. It is time the Faulkner name was associated with something that stands firm. In a surprising move of penance, Jacqueline revealed that she had spent the last several weeks quietly reclaiming every single share of Sherman's construction empire. She hadn't kept them for profit. She had already transferred the entire portfolio into the newly formed charity, turning a murderer's wealth into a tool for redemption. Memories are like hot tea. At first they scald you with their intensity, but given enough time they begin to warm you from the inside out. I felt a sense of closure I hadn't thought possible. A week later, I stood on the manicured lawn of a technical university for the inauguration of the Catherine Faulkner Safety Architecture Foundation. The summer sun glinted off a new bronze plaque, and the rustle of leaves in the warm breeze felt like a soft applause. I looked out at the rows of young, eager architecture students, their faces full of the same idealistic fire I once possessed. "Do not build for fame," I told them, my voice carrying across the courtyard. "Build to protect." A single misplaced line on a drawing can kill more efficiently than a bullet. From the back of the crowd, Dr. Bailey gave me a slow, encouraging nod. "Catherine would be so proud of you, Wayne," he said later as the crowd dispersed. I breathed in deeply, the smell of fresh cement from a nearby construction site filling my lungs, the scent of a beginning. But as the sun began to set, the weight of the pen I had found in the courtroom returned to my mind. I pulled it from my pocket, looking again at the laser-etched coordinates: 40.7128 degrees north, 74.0060 degrees west. A cold realization washed over me as I checked the land deed for the Foundation's new headquarters. The coordinates on the pen led exactly here to the very ground where I was currently standing. This was no coincidence. It was an invitation to a much darker and more complex game. I reached out and touched the cool bronze surface of the memorial plaque, but the metal offered no comfort. If these coordinates were a message, then beneath my feet, right here in the shadow of this new beginning, another secret of 81KV7 was waiting to be unburied. The earth below us has never truly been still, and the architecture of this conspiracy was far deeper than any bridge I had ever designed in my long career. Looking back at this journey through family betrayal, I realize now that my biggest mistake wasn't trusting Sherman. It was staying silent for too long. These grandpa stories I share aren't just tales of survival. They're warnings written in the scars of lived experience. Don't be like me. Don't let pride keep you trapped in a prison of your own making. When you see the cracks forming in your family foundation, speak up immediately. Family betrayal doesn't announce itself with a roar. It whispers in small betrayals, overlooked cruelties, and convenient lies. I ignored the tremors until the entire bridge collapsed. The lesson I carry from this nightmare is simple but profound. Your silence protects the predator, not the victim. Document everything. Trust your instincts. And never ever believe that blood alone guarantees loyalty. Family betrayal taught me that character matters more than DNA. Through all this darkness, I learned that the Lord's timing is perfect, even when we're walking through fire. Faith sustained me when evidence felt insufficient, when my body failed me, and when my own daughter chose money over her father's life. These grandpa stories exist to remind you integrity is the only structure that never collapses. Build your life on truth, not convenience. Fight for justice even when the courtroom feels rigged. And remember, the strongest bridges are built on foundations of honesty, not the shifting sands of greed. That's why I keep sharing these grandpa stories, so you can learn from my pain. Your moral compass is the only blueprint that truly matters. Thank you for walking this difficult path with me until the very end. I genuinely love to hear your perspective. Drop a comment, sharing what you would have done if you found yourself trapped in Wayne's impossible situation. Your insights matter deeply to me. If this narrative resonated with you emotionally, please consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss future stories. A gentle reminder: while inspired by real-world themes of elder abuse and corporate corruption, certain elements have been dramatized for storytelling impact. If this particular content doesn't align with your preferences, feel free to explore other videos that might suit you better.